I'm going to talk about how we are part of something bigger. You know, this phrase, you are part of something bigger. We've all heard the sentence before, and we all kind of sort of know what it means. And I'll get to the biblical message of this phrase in a minute. But I actually just want to start off with a little bit of a diversion. Does this look familiar to you? I'm sure most of us have actually seen this before. You know, sometimes when you log onto a website, you need to fill out this captcha, you know, to prove that you are human and not a robot. And a while back, it was two words, you know, that were garbled in some way, and you'd have to type out the words to prove that you are not a robot. It's an easy task for humans to do, but it's actually difficult for computers to figure out what is written over there. Now, what you might not know is only one of those words were to test if you were human. The other word was something Google was struggling with as part of their book digitization program. So they were like, okay, here's a word that we don't recognize in a book. We're going to outsource it to a human, one of these people that need to log into a website. And, you know, they use this capture process for it. And it doesn't just help with that one word in that one book, but it also trained the AI to recognize that kind of word in the future. Now, outsourcing word recognition like this, it actually allowed Google to blaze through their book digitization project, which is why you actually don't see these word captures anymore. So what do we see now? Well, for a while, it was numbers, if you remember. And it would be a picture of a number which would look suspiciously like a blurry photograph of a front door. And guess what? That was helping Google Maps to identify addresses from pictures taken through Google Street View. These days, capture tasks tend to involve something like, you know, click all the images that contain a road sign or a bus. And guess what? That's because Google's parent company has an autonomous vehicle project, and they need human brains to help train their artificial intelligence to recognize things like road signs and buses. Now, interestingly enough, these captures are real time. So if you're asked to identify a road sign, for example, that's because there's a car out there on the street at that moment that needs to know if that is a road sign. So if you do see that, you need to act quickly because otherwise someone could get hurt. That last bit isn't true, or is it? Anyway, it's very interesting how these small little things that we do without even thinking about it can actually be part of something huge, whether we realize it or not. And that's the thing. Sometimes we don't know what bigger picture we are changing or completing by decisions we make and actions that we do each day. Right, so let's get into the Bible. Specifically, I want to look at the book of Ruth, and we're going to skip ahead to chapter 4. Before we do that, though, there's a word that I want us all to learn, and that word is the Hebrew word hesed. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. However, I'm going to call it hesed throughout this small talk. So what is hesed? It's a Hebrew word in the Bible that captures the many attributes of God, especially those that speak about how he treats people. It's like his kindness, his faithfulness, grace, mercy, love, and his loyalty. It's the way that God treats you. And it's a word I not only want us to learn, but to live. It's a word that describes perfectly how Jesus lived his life, how we should live our lives. And in the book of Ruth, we're going to actually see two people who lived their lives showing hesed to other people. And when they did this, their lives had a beautiful impact on everyone around them. So let me review the story of Ruth before we get to the happy ending. The great thing about the book of Ruth is it almost reads like a series that we could watch on TV nowadays, with 4 episodes, with its 4 chapters. So we'll title episode 1, No Food and Empty. It's where this Jewish family moves from Bethlehem, God's promised land, to Moab because there's no food in Israel. But the father and sons die, leaving an old widow named Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law without any men in a man-dominated world. One daughter-in-law, Orpah, goes back to her people, and while the other, Ruth, makes Naomi's people and God her own, and in support of Naomi heads back to Bethlehem. Episode 2 will title as Food But No Future. We read about how this young immigrant named Ruth cares for Naomi, and that she goes out into personal danger and works in the harvest fields. God leads her to the fields of a man named Boaz, who sees her needs, provides for her, protects her from harm, and helps her to belong. But the harvest only lasts 7 weeks. At the end, Ruth and Naomi have food, but they don't have a future. Chapter 3, we read about having this hope but uncertainty. Naomi and Ruth plot together to find a place of lasting belonging. Because in that culture back in the day, the only way that these widows would find a place of belonging would have been for Ruth to marry. In a challenging and dangerous moment, Ruth and Boaz demonstrate unwavering integrity, going against all cultural norms. Ruth proposes to Boaz, and he says yes, but like any modern day movie, that is a romance movie, there's another man who may get in the way of Boaz and Ruth marrying. So deep inside, we all know that guy's not really the right man for Ruth, don't we? But that's the way it is. There is someone else who has the legal right to marry Ruth and to keep Boaz from doing so. But Boaz has a plan. Now that's where we are in episode 4, chapter 4, where we will see how Hesed actually triumphs. Because of the way that these two people lived their lives, we will actually get to an unbelievable ending with celebration and triumph. So let's see how it actually unfolded. I will read for us from Ruth chapter 4, the first 10 verses, which we will call the decision. It says, Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, Turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, Buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, Buy it for yourself, he drew his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mashlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mashlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. See, when we read from Ruth, these first few verses, I feel as if I'm there. I can picture it in my mind. I'm watching Boaz, going about his work. This first act in the final episode, it takes place in Bethlehem City Gate. And this is the place where, in the big town, decisions were made. The society that Ruth lived in was so fully male-dominated that she had little choice about her husband. To think that a group of men sitting at the city gate would discuss and determine her future husband is a little bit offensive in today's terms. But by the law of the time, it was that when a man died who owned property, his widow, or in this case, his son's widow, was to be brought into the family of the nearest kingman. So the property would continue to remain in the name of the man who died, in this case, Elimelech. Ruth, as we saw in episode 3, wanted to marry Boaz, and he wanted to marry her. However, there was this nearer kinsman. So Boaz comes up with this way to navigate this. He approaches this closer kinsman, a man who is left unnamed in the story, and he then calls 10 of the city elders to come and listen in to their conversation. Boaz says, Elimelech's widow, Naomi, is home and she needs money. So Elimelech's property is available to the nearest kinsman who wants to buy it. And I'd like to think that this guardian redeemer, this nearest kinsman, he probably knows that Naomi is actually too old to have children. So in his mind, he's thinking, for very little money, I can actually acquire this valuable piece of property and put it in my own name. So of course he says, I want that property. I will take it. I will buy it. But in verse 5, Boaz is actually very smart. And he says, on the day you buy that land from Naomi, you actually also get Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow. And as soon as those words are out of Boaz's mouth, the guardian redeemer says, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. And by that, what he is saying is he would have to pay money to get this property. He would have to take care of Naomi and of Ruth, and he would have the problem of having an additional wife. And if Ruth was to give birth to a son, he wouldn't even be able to keep the property. So he says, you redeem it yourself, Boaz, before all the elders of the city, and Boaz agreed. So as we know, the guardian redeemer took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. And then there was a celebration. Now the celebration, let's read on from verse 11 up to 17. It reads as follows. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, the happy ending here is as good as any that you'll find in any book or movie of nowadays. It starts right there in the city gate when the elders shout out blessings for Boaz. They say, he'll have this new wife and he'll have a family and he'll become important to Israel. They speak the blessing to Boaz that he will prosper and that his name will never be forgotten. Ruth was also part of this blessing as well. They said, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. In doing so, they are pronouncing that she, a Moabite immigrant, fully belongs to the greatest of the women in their people. But now when the scene moves 9 months forward to when Ruth gives birth to a son, I especially love the fact that the Jewish women in the town break out in this amazing blessing upon this Moabite. They call her better than 7 sons. And to complete this story, we know that Naomi is blessed by receiving a male heir through her line and that of her husband. Now, it's very touching to read that, Naomi took this child, laid him on her lap, and she cared for him. This bitter old woman that we saw right in the beginning of Ruth is empty and bitter no more. The entire town was blessed with this great joy. It's a celebration, and God, as we know, loves celebration. Happy endings always have celebrations, but it actually doesn't stop there, just with this little town of Bethlehem. God had a bigger plan in mind than anyone could have seen. Because, let's read from 17 onwards to the end. The woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, who was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And those are the generations. Now, it seems to come a little bit out of the blue. Who could have expected this? That, I think the author actually put this here, kind of to take people's breath away, because we're just reading of these ordinary people, these small decisions that they made, who in the eyes of the world may have seemed, coincidental or insignificant, have led to something bigger. This immigrant woman from one of the worst countries in that time became committed to God, actually gave birth to the one in the line of their greatest king, King David. The message of this book of Ruth is that God rescues his people from the deep, dark days of the time of the judges, not so that, not through necessarily superheroes like Samson and Gideon and these people we read of, but actually through normal people as well, like Ruth and Boaz, who are just being faithful, and they're showing this hesed in their daily relationships and their choices. And of course, you and I know something that even the writer of this book didn't know, is that these decisions not only led to David, but actually to Jesus. This child born to Boaz and Ruth was in the lineage that led to the Savior of the world. In Matthew 1, we can read the genealogy, and you'll see it there. Ruth, Boaz, and their son Obed are all there. These ordinary people who were part of something bigger, much bigger. God used them to be part of his blessing to all people. And the same can also be true of each of us. Now, things don't just happen, and we need to understand this. God is always present and at work. When things aren't going the way that we want them to go, God is still at work. We need to learn to trust him when we don't understand, even as Ruth did. We need to know that there's no God-forsaken place in this universe. God is always present, and he's always wanting us to learn and to trust him. When things are going horribly bad, as they were for Ruth at the beginning of the book, it's hard to believe this for ourselves. But the whole Bible declares that this is true. God will ultimately make all things new, and he will establish a kingdom in which all is just and right. There are things to change our lives, ways we can change our lives. And I think a way of changing our lives is changing the way we live it. So we need to live a life of hesed. God calls us all to make the kinds of decisions that reflect his ways to our world. Again, I really don't want us to forget this word. It's a word that I want to have ingrained in my mind, in my heart for the rest of my life. And I want to always try and live this kind of life. And let's look back on how this actually looked in the story of Ruth. Orpah compared to Ruth. Orpah made the choice that made sense in the eyes of the world, while Ruth did not. Ruth was simply based on wanting to support and to be faithful to Naomi and to honor God, and she kept living that way, a life of hesed. Boaz, compared to the guardian redeemer, the guardian redeemer made the decision that would have made financial sense. If he had redeemed Naomi and Ruth, he would have lost money, but then would have lost the land as well. Of course, the same is true for Boaz, but Boaz made the decision that meant treating others as God treats him, the way of personal sacrifice to bring hope, help, and blessing to others. So I want to remind you how Boaz showed hesed to his to this Moabite woman that no one else even seemed to notice. Ruth was an immigrant out in the field living the life of a beggar. Now, what did Boaz do? He saw her as God sees people. He provided for her, he protected her, and he helped her to belong. Ruth and Boaz did not act according to the wisdom of the world. They didn't do what normal people would usually do. They didn't ask, what is in it for me, or will it fulfill me? Both Orpah and the Guardian Redeemer did what most how-to books would tell them what to do. But the decisions that Ruth and Boaz made involved personal sacrifice to bring help and to bring blessings to others. It's the way that God acts towards us. The act of Hesed always calls us to be related to those in need and the heart's desire to help. It's not a duty, but an act of love. So let us live a life of Hesed. Now, I would like to have a discussion with everyone that has joined us tonight, and I've actually got some talking points for us to also maybe just help us along. They're not questions that need to be answered, but maybe it'll help spark some conversation if someone also just maybe has something they'd like to add.